This Dicebreaker video is sponsored by Wild Bill's. Ditch the manufactured flavors. Your taste buds deserve better. Treat yourself to Wild Bill's premium handcrafted soda pop. Mouth-watering beverages that allow you to escape to the most interesting places imaginable. Cheers to refusing the drink from the mainstream. Cheers to kick-ass canned. Cheers to being veteran-owned and operated. At Wild Bill's, flavor isn't everything. It's the only thing. Use discount code CHEERS15 for 15% off your first order.
In every sense of the word, Descent Legends of the Dark is the biggest board game of the summer. The successor, not sequel, to Fantasy Flight Games' beloved dungeon crawler Descent Journeys in the Dark, Legends of the Dark has nearly a decade's worth of expectation and hype riding on its shoulders. Luckily, they're pretty broad shoulders, encased in this dense cardboard cube, roughly the size of a small footstool, that costs, take a seat for a moment, 175 quid. Let's address the pixelated elephant in the room and the biggest reason why Legends of the Dark isn't Journeys in the Dark 3rd edition. In addition to its very well stocked box of plastic and cardboard toys, you'll need a free companion app to play, replacing the human kind of dungeon master-like overlord of Descent's past. In fairness, Journeys in the Dark was eventually given a companion app, Road to Legend, that introduced an AI opponent, but Legend's hybrid approach is baked in as absolutely mandatory. There's no getting around it, you're gonna need an app to play. Now, if you're already convinced that pixels and paper shouldn't mix, this isn't going to be the game to convince you otherwise. In fact, Legends of the Dark has just about the deepest app integration of almost any board game I've played. The good news is that it's a quality experience on both table and screen. For the most part, anyway. Having now spent over 40 hours with the game and seen its campaign to completion, I found myself really appreciating its ambition and boldness, while also hitting severe moments of frustration and disappointment at its flaws. On the table, Legends of the Dark is an astonishing presence. The main reason for this kind of awkwardly proportioned Kallax-filling cube, which, surprise, arrives half empty, is to store a table's worth of 3D terrain, which you'll spend your first couple of hours building, kind of like a Lego set for fans of trees, stone pillars and bookcases. I promise, it's more exciting than it sounds. Cardboard terrain may seem like a simple addition, but as anyone who remembers the days of classic dungeon crawler Hero Quest will know, that third dimension goes a long, long way in conjuring up Descent's fantasy world of Terrinoth and its varied dungeons, forests and settlements. Now, dotting some trees around is one thing, but Legends of the Dark's visual panache kicks into overdrive the first time it asks you to take some of those pillars and suspend a map tile above the table. The game's creators use the terrain to spellbinding effect, creating multiple layers of verticality in the environments that couples with some of the most impressive level design any modern dungeon crawler has to offer. Characters can find themselves suddenly falling between levels, climbing circling stairs of a tower that actually ascends from the tabletop, outrunning crumbling architecture which vanishes off the table with every passing round, and even clambering up objects to access new areas, sometimes all in the space of a single scenario. The terrain couples with the companion app to offer an experience that actually comes closer to a tabletop RPG in terms of players' ability to interact with the world. Almost every 3D object can be interacted with on screen, often with a variety of options, where you climb the tree to scout ahead, use its branches to reach a new level, pick its fruit to regain health, or simply just forage some materials for later on. In these moments, the benefit of having a companion app operate as a digital dungeon master is obvious. Handling so many dynamic interactions using just cards or tables in a book would be overwhelming. What's more, the box's handy storage and app's step-by-step approach even manages to keep the time spent slotting together each map to a minimum, with new areas revealed as the players explore, rather than kind of requiring an upfront building session. It's seriously slick and testament to the careful balance struck between physical impact and digital convenience. Of course, flashy presentation would mean little without a decent game attached. After all, this is more than just an expensive box of D&D terrain. Fortunately, Legends of the Dark has fun gameplay in spades, spread across a campaign that took us somewhere between 35 and 40 hours to finish in full with 2 players. That includes both the main story missions and all the available side quests. Each one kind of lasted between 1 to 2 hours, although some are a little bit shorter depending on how things play out. The relatively consistent length of each scenario makes Legends of the Dark feel like the ideal game for a group looking for a weekly role-playing adventure, without the admin of planning a session or having to nominate a GM. Now, the surface of the game is nuts and bolts dungeon crawling. Players spend their turns moving their characters around each grid board map and performing 2 actions, rolling dice to calculate everything from attacking enemies to picking a lock on a treasure chest. Skills checks are always 2 6-sided dice, while combat and defense ranges from a d6 up to a d12 depending on your ability. Alone, that would be enough to fill, an hour or 2, but not quite enough to justify dozens of hours and that price tag, or make Descent any different to the hundreds of samey dungeon crawlers clad in different RPG-like cosplay. Fortunately, it's not alone. Descent's familiar dice-chucking fare combines with an engaging use of double-sided cards for weapons, skills, and the characters themselves, allowing players to flip cards to clear negative conditions such as poison, fatigue tokens gained by performing more powerful abilities, and even access alternative effects and options on the reverse of each card. Other conditions inflict damage for flipping cards, leading to mid-game dilemmas about how to create the best combo for smashing enemies or dodging traps or reaching treasure without taking too much damage or spending too many of your precious turns preparing. Like the terrain, having every card offer a different benefit is a simple addition that adds another crucial dimension. There's plenty of room to experiment and play around with skills, all without dragging turns down into checking complex rules in the book or long moments of umming and erring. Allowing fatigue tokens to build up rather than be a limited resource collected and spent means players are able to pop off special moves on a pretty regular basis. You'll never have to spend turn after turn chipping away with basic attacks because your one ultra ability whiffed. With rare exception, turns in Legends of the Dark always feel meaningful and fresh. There's always something to interact with, an ability to experiment with, or somewhere new to explore. You'll want to experiment and explore for the whole of those 35 plus hours too. Having long been completely unfazed by publisher Fantasy Flight Games' repeated attempts to turn Descent's world of Terrinoth into more than yet another forgettable fantasy setting, Legends of the Dark has finally succeeded in getting me to invest in and care about its lore. This is largely in thanks to Legends of the Dark's would-be fellowship of party members, who offer both varied gameplay, sneaky cat person Chance who flips his character card to disappear back into the shadows before another stealthy strike is a particular highlight, and engaging character development as their backstories are fleshed out. I found myself really invested in Paladin Bryn's familial drama, Chase's escape from a life of crime, and Vayrix's strive for independence as a dragon hybrid, to name just a few examples, all of which provide greater stakes to scenarios driven by focused character development rather than just more hacking and slashing. The playable characters also mark a much needed step forward from the tired tropes of classic cis-white male-dominated fantasy, including a non-binary character, a deaf character who communicates with sign language, which forms the kind of gentle basis of a particularly memorable scene, and multiple people of colour. The wider story, because after all this game is billed as just Act 1 in a planned series, revolves around familiar fantasy staples. There's magical MacGuffins, kingdoms in peril, and something about the end of the world. It's effective rather than exhausting for the most part, but it highlights the characters as the real draw. The bulk of the narrative is experienced through the companion app, which acts as part IKEA building instruction manual and part GM during scenarios, before switching to a visual novel between quests. Scenes can be linked to specific scenarios, randomized encounters while traveling across the game's digital map, or even presented as digital side events that are resolved entirely within the app. With characters static on either side of the screen in most cases, the presentation is basic, there's kind of limited animation and voice acting but only at key moments, but it works on the strength of Legends of the Dark's expressive and stylized character artwork. The interludes don't outstay their welcome, and they manage to feel important to the ongoing story through player decisions that can have a significant outcome on various plot elements. As in Mansions of Madness and Journeys in Middle-earth, two other games from Fantasy Flight that use companion apps and combine them with a physical board game. The app's flexibility provides room for the game's creators to push Legends of the Dark's mission design to its extremes without just requiring another truckload of physical components. Legends of the Dark boasts some of the most purely entertaining scenarios I've come across in a fantasy adventure game in, well, ever. Rarely do two missions feel the same. You might be rescuing survivors from a burning building one moment, attempting to halt a cultist ritual the next, before solving a murder mystery by taking notes in an actual notepad, and then simply wailing on a tough boss and their cronies after that. This could well be the closest that a dungeon crawler has come to the open-ended creativity of a tabletop RPG campaign. Legends of the Dark's app cleverly stretches its contents to the limit in terms of invention. While it might sound ridiculous to describe a game of this size and this price as being surprisingly modest, there is a sense of quality over quantity. There are a few dozen miniatures in the box, but each basic enemy type is given variety by the app's dynamic mission generation. Bosses too share models, but they exhibit unique behaviour that allows them to feel distinct. Like the terrain and double-sided character cards, remixing the same pieces into new arrangements is thoroughly effective at keeping things interesting for the hefty playtime that Descent demands. The app injects some of that freshness behind the scenes as well, with the items and discoveries collected during each run randomised depending on your playthrough, combined with what feel like meaningful narrative paths that players' story decisions lead their characters down, and the chance for failure of a scenario to impact the ongoing world and its impact on the party. This means there's value in starting a new campaign once you've seen the credits. Unfortunately, this randomisation can have its drawbacks. During our main playthrough, we were only able to upgrade a single item via the app's town menus, which are accessed by the players between each scenario to equip new gear and enhance their loadout. While we were able to collect a number of different attachments for weapons, it was only ever a case of swapping one thing for another, never a case of really improving what we had. The limited number of equipment slots led to much of our inventory and crafting materials going to waste, with a frustrating sense that we'd missed out on one of the game's key aspects solely as the result of poor luck. It's worth saying that we actually contacted Fantasy Flight to talk about my group's experience, and they confirmed that the app's randomization does mean that some groups will see very few drops during a typical run, while others might be laden with recipes. And while the app is largely well designed and presented, its flaws grow into deeper cracks in the experience as the result of Legends of the Dark's scale and ambition. We spent more than 40 hours across our full playthrough and several shorter comparison runs with the app. Around 15 hours of that time was spent with a pre-release version of the PC app, with the remainder using the full release version, which is available through Steam. During that time, we suffered a number of bugs, including the inability to complete certain quests. One such experience, which made it temporarily impossible for us to progress further in the story, was actually reported to Fantasy Flight before release and subsequently patched. In another issue, we couldn't unlock any further skills for a character via in-game feats, and there were also a multitude of smaller visual and user interface issues. In an experience lasting a couple of hours, these would be frustrating, but possible to wipe clean by starting again. But in a continuous campaign lasting dozens of hours, the chance to find yourself stuck between muddling through to the end with a growing list of annoyances, or starting again with no promise that you'll even see the same events or receive the same items, it just ended up kind of souring the later hours of the campaign. This was made even worse by an apparent leap in difficulty around 2/3 of the way through the campaign. Having successfully completed all but one scenario in the game's first half, which I'd like to point out we only lost by just about one turn and a couple of unlucky rolls, we suddenly found ourselves on a losing streak of over half a dozen separate scenarios. Enemies were suddenly able to drain characters' health bars in a single round of combat, while our increasingly desperate attempts to either fight, scraping off a few points of damage each turn, or run for the scenario's objectives were met equally in failure. The difficulty spike was so extreme on even the standard difficulty level, I ended up contacting Fantasy Flight to ask whether the game scaled the experience to lower player counts, with players recommended to use one character per person, or two if you're playing by yourself. because the experience just felt so wildly different in challenge to our first few hours. I was told that the app does adjust difficulty to the number of characters. Regardless, it made for such an unpleasant stretch of endless defeat hour after hour that we were somewhat relieved to reach the final quest when it arrived. And even that, the finale itself, is a 2+ hour of gauntlet of enemies and objectives that you have to restart if you fail, with no chance to optionally pick up additional items or skills beforehand if you feel ill-equipped. Some of Legends of the Dark's frustrations are smaller quibbles, but they add up to bigger problems over the time demanded by the game. While the app is largely excellent at providing rules reference and gameplay reminders, such as the unique effects of terrain like barricades, or how enemies behave after certain attacks, there are a number of things that fall into gaps between the rulebook and the app, making them easy to miss, poorly explained, or just in need of constant double checking. Now, I'll be honest, these are issues that may well be patched and improved later on. After all, several patches were released for the app while we were reviewing this game. But for now, they stand out as noticeable spots that tarnish what is otherwise a really highly polished offering. In a game half of Legends of the Dark's length or price, they would be easier to overlook. But here, they just contradict the promise of a wholly premium experience. It's especially frustrating because when everything in Descent Legends of the Dark comes together as planned, the 3D terrain, the miniatures, the companion app, the storytelling, the characters, the scenario design, the gameplay, it easily ranks as among the most impressive and entertaining fantasy board games in memory. It's ambitious in its digital innovation, cinematic in its physical presentation, engaging in its combined delivery, and most importantly, it's just huge fun to play with friends. At its best, it feels like board gaming's answer to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's a big, flashy crowd pleaser that knows just exactly how big, flashy, and crowd pleasing it is. It may be refinement over revolution of one of the hobby's most tried and tested formulas. After all, we've seen plenty of fantasy adventurers crawling for a dungeon over the years, but the refinement here is almost second to none. That said, this is still a box that costs about twice as much as a typical board game, and that is hard to ignore, especially in the light of its flaws. Is buying Descent Legends of the Dark really better value than spending that same money on 2 or even more board games that may not equal it separately, but each offer something not a million miles away, albeit with a bit less visual flair and kind of confident melding of ideas? Honestly, it's a tough question to answer, and if you're not likely to commit to seeing everything that Descent has to offer over its dozens of hours, I'd probably just recommend finding something else. But if you're willing to let it work its magic through both thick and thin, I don't think you'll ultimately be disappointed with letting this replace your weekly D&D session for a few months. All I do know is that for all the frustrations I experienced, I am still itching to fire up another campaign of Legends of the Dark and spend a dozen more hours in that world with those characters, that terrain, and those scenarios. And when this game's already announced sequel, Act 2, arrives, you can bet that I'll be looking forward to returning to Terrinoth, something I honestly never thought I would say. Descent Legends of the Dark may not be a perfect game, but I'll tell you one thing, it's a hell of a time. So that's Descent Legends of the Dark, this year's biggest, and I mean biggest, board game release. As you can tell, I really enjoyed my time with it, with a few exceptions, and if you go and pick it up, I would love to hear what you think, so let us know in the comments. Meanwhile, if you're looking for more on Descent, dungeon crawlers, board games, RPGs, any of that, you can find it right here on Dicebreaker, the channel you're already watching on youtube.com/Dicebreaker. You can also find more articles on board games, RPGs, everything that goes on a tabletop, including more thoughts on Descent, over on our website dicebreaker.com. But for now, I've been Matt Jarvis, these have been my thoughts on Descent Legends of the Dark. I need to go and find somewhere to store this enormous box. So while I go and do that, thank you for watching, and have a lovely day.